There's a particular silence that happens when 40 people in a room realize, all at once, that the person who just walked in is supposed to be dead. I didn't know that silence had a sound until I caused it myself, standing in the back doorway of St. Augustine's Cathedral, wearing a black dress I'd bought that morning because I owned nothing appropriate for a funeral I hadn't planned on attending. My name is Vivian Cole. That's not the name I was born with, and for 15 years, almost nobody alive knew that the woman standing in that doorway and the daughter buried, supposedly, in the Sterling family plot were the exact same person. My father's name was Richard Sterling. If you've ever bought a car built in the last 20 years, there's a reasonable chance one of his company's brake components is sitting somewhere under the hood. Sterling Dynamics built a reputation over 4 decades as one of the most trusted names in automotive safety manufacturing in the country. My father built that reputation himself, starting in a rented garage outside Detroit with 2 employees and a line of credit he personally guaranteed. By the time I was born, he was already a wealthy man. By the time I turned 18, he was something closer to a legend in his industry, the kind of founder business magazines wrote admiring profiles about, the kind of man people stood up a little straighter around. I want to tell you, before anything else, exactly who I was before any of this happened, because it matters for understanding what came later. I wasn't a socialite. I wasn't interested in the parties or the boards my stepmother spent her life cultivating invitations to. I was a quiet, serious 20-year-old engineering student who spent her summer internship at her father's company doing exactly what I'd been trained to do, checking quality control data, line by line, batch by batch, because I genuinely believed, the way only a 20-year-old can believe something completely, that the numbers mattered more than anyone's comfort. That belief is what got me erased from my own family. I found the discrepancy in late June, 15 years ago, in a batch of brake caliper assemblies destined for a mid-sized sedan manufacturer that represented nearly a third of Sterling Dynamics' annual revenue at the time. The failure rate in stress testing was almost 4 times higher than the documentation claimed. I assumed, at first, that I'd made an error. I checked it 3 more times. I hadn't. When I brought it to my supervisor, a quiet, careful man named Nathaniel Boyd who'd worked at the company for almost 20 years, he went pale in a way I didn't fully understand until much later. He told me to bring it to him directly, and not to mention it to anyone else yet. I did. 2 days later, the data I'd pulled had been quietly revised in the system. The discrepancy was gone, replaced with numbers that matched what had originally been reported to the manufacturer. I want to be honest about something. I was 20. I didn't have a plan. I didn't understand corporate politics or the weight of what I'd actually stumbled into. I just knew, with the same simple certainty I'd had about the original numbers, that something had been deliberately hidden, and that hidden defective brake components were currently being installed in cars that real families were going to be driving their children around in. So, I went to my father. He listened to me carefully, the way he always had, in his office on the top floor of the Sterling Dynamics headquarters, and I remember the exact moment his expression changed from concern to something closer to fear. Not fear of me. Fear for me, although I didn't understand that distinction at the time. "Who else have you told this to?" he asked, and his voice had a tightness in it I'd never heard before. "Just Mr. Boyd," I said. "And you." He told me to go home, to not come back to the office the next day, to not discuss it with anyone, including my stepmother. I thought, at the time, that he was protecting the company. I was wrong about that too, although it took me 15 years to understand exactly how wrong. 3 days later, Nathaniel Boyd was quietly let go, officially for performance issues after 19 years of unblemished service. The week after that, my father came to my apartment, alone, late at night, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days, and told me something I have never fully been able to explain to anyone who wasn't there to see his face while he said it. "You need to disappear," he said. "Not move away. Disappear completely. I need you to trust me on this, Vivian. More than you have ever trusted me about anything in your life." I didn't trust him. Not at first. I thought he was protecting the company's reputation, protecting himself, choosing the brand his name was stitched into over his own daughter. I said as much, angrily, the kind of angry only a betrayed 20-year-old can manage.
He didn't argue with me.
He just said, "There are people in this who are far more dangerous than you understand, and the only way I can guarantee they stop is if they believe you're gone.
Permanently.
I am not asking you to forgive me for this. I am asking you to survive it. I want to describe that night more fully, because I've replayed it so many times since that it's worn smooth in my memory, the way a stone gets smooth from being turned over in your hand too many times. My father sat on the edge of my second-hand couch, still in his suit from a bored dinner he'd left early, his hands folded the way they always folded when he was working through a problem he hadn't solved yet. He didn't look like a billionaire that night. He looked like a frightened man twice my age who had run out of better options. "You think I built this company because I wanted to be rich," he said, somewhere in the middle of that conversation, not really asking me, more thinking aloud. "I built it because your grandfather worked himself into an early grave at a factory that didn't care whether the machines he operated were safe, and I swore I'd build something different. Something that actually mattered to the people who trusted it." He looked at me then, and I remember thinking, even through my anger, that I had never seen him look so completely undone. "I am not protecting the company tonight, Vivian. I genuinely do not care in this exact moment if the company survives this. I care if you do." I didn't believe him completely. Some small, stubborn part of 20-year-old me assumed he was simply better than most people at sounding sincere while protecting his own interests. It took me 15 years, and a recording made by a dying man who had nothing left to gain from lying, to finally understand that he had told me the complete truth that night, in the only way he knew how, without yet being able to explain exactly what he was protecting me from. I didn't know that night who they were. I assumed, in my anger, that he meant the company's lawyers, or the manufacturer worried about a recall, or simply his own pride. I packed 2 bags that same week. I took the money he gave me, more money than I understood the size of at the time, money that came with a new name attached to a new identity already prepared, frighteningly fast, by people I never met. I left the only life I had ever known, and 3 weeks later, my father held a funeral for me, for a car accident that never happened, on a road in a country I had never visited, attended by everyone I had ever loved. I watched the obituary online from a rented room 2,000 miles away, reading my own name in the past tense, and I want you to understand that there is no version of that experience that prepares a person for what comes after. I grieved myself. I am not exaggerating when I say that. For years, I grieved a version of my own life the way you'd grieve a person who actually died, because in every meaningful sense, she had. I built a new life slowly, carefully, the way you'd rebuild anything from almost nothing. I finished my engineering degree under my new name, using my late mother's maiden name, Cole, because it was the only piece of my old identity I allowed myself to keep. I became, eventually, an independent product safety auditor, the kind of consultant manufacturers hire, somewhat ironically, to find exactly the kind of defect I had once found in my own father's company. I never went back to Detroit. I never reached out. Some wounds, I told myself for 15 years, are better left exactly where they happened. Then, 11 days ago, a notification on my phone from an industry newsletter I still subscribe to out of old habit told me that Richard Sterling, founder of Sterling Dynamics, had passed away at 78 after a long illness. I sat with that notification for 3 full days before I made the decision that brought me to that cathedral doorway. I told myself I was going for closure. I told myself I simply needed to see, with my own eyes, that the man who built and then unbuilt my entire life was actually gone. I did not tell myself the full truth, which was simpler and harder to admit. Some quiet part of me still needed to know why. So I walked through those doors, into a cathedral full of people who believed, with absolute sincerity, that they were burying a man who had lost his daughter 15 years earlier in a car accident on a winding coastal road in Portugal. The first person to see me was my stepmother, Margaret Sterling, seated in the front pew in black, her face turning toward the back of the church the way people's faces do when a door creaks louder than expected. I watched the recognition arrive in her eyes in 3 distinct stages: confusion, disbelief, and finally something I can only describe as pure, unfiltered terror. She did not faint, although for one strange second I genuinely thought she might. She simply stood up, slowly, gripping the pew in front of her, and said, in a voice that carried across the entire cathedral despite barely being louder than a whisper. That's not possible. Every single head in that room turned to look at exactly what she was looking at. I stood in the doorway of my own father's funeral, 15 years after my own funeral, and watched an entire room full of people who had mourned me for over a decade slowly realize that the woman standing in front of them was not a ghost, and not an imposter, but the actual, living daughter they had buried with an empty casket a decade and a half earlier. Nobody in that cathedral knew what to do with me. I want to describe that honestly, because it's one of the strangest experiences I've ever had, standing perfectly still while an entire room decided, individually and out loud, whether I was real. My half-brother, Caleb, who I hadn't seen since he was 17 and was now a broad-shouldered man in his early 30s running the company's daily operations, walked toward me first, his expression somewhere between hope and suspicion. "Vivian," he said, the way you'd say a word in a language you weren't sure you remembered correctly. "It's me," I said. "I know how this looks." "You don't," he said quietly. "You really, genuinely don't." I learned, over the next several hours, sitting in a small side room of the cathedral while a funeral director tried diplomatically to figure out whether to proceed with the service, exactly how completely I had been erased. It wasn't just the funeral, 15 years ago. With the empty casket I would later learn had actually contained nothing but a sealed box of my childhood belongings, placed there, I assume, so the weight would feel right to the pallbearers. It was everything that came after. My name had been removed from the family trust documentation within 6 months. The company's official history, the version printed in anniversary booklets and told to new employees during orientation, mentioned my father's 2 children, Caleb and Lily, with no reference to a third child at all, as though I had simply never existed rather than died. Lily, my half-sister, born 2 years after my death, now 17 years old, sitting in the third pew that day in a black dress, looking at me with an expression I will never fully be able to describe. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to the specific vertigo of meeting a person you've spent your entire life mourning without ever having met. "I used to ask Mom about you," she told me later that evening, her voice small in a way that didn't match the directness of what she was saying. "She kept one photo of you on the mantle, and she'd tell me you died trying to help someone in an accident before I was born. I used to talk to that photo sometimes, when I was little. I can't believe I'm actually talking to you instead." I asked Caleb, gently, why the family registry, the official one filed with the company's foundation paperwork, listed only 2 children instead of 3. "Mom handled all of that," he said. After the accident, she said it was too painful to keep updating documents with your name on them. Dad never corrected it. I always assumed it was just grief. I never thought to question the timeline too closely. Lily found me later that same evening, sitting alone on a bench outside the cathedral's side garden, long after most of the mourners had finally gone home. She sat down beside me without asking permission, the way only a 17-year-old who hasn't yet learned to be careful with strangers can do, except I wasn't a stranger to her. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. "Can I ask you something that might sound strange?" she said. "You can ask me anything." "Did you actually want to come back?" she said. "Or did you only come because he died?" She pulled her knees up onto the bench, wrapping her arms around them. "Because I think I need to know if you would have stayed gone forever, if he hadn't." I sat with that question longer than was probably comfortable for either of us. "I don't know," I finally admitted. I told myself for 15 years that some things are better left exactly where they happened. I think some part of me genuinely believed that, right up until I saw the obituary. I looked at her, this stranger who had somehow grown up missing me her entire life without ever knowing me at all. "I'm here now, though. Whatever made me come back, I'm not planning on disappearing again." She nodded slowly, like she was deciding whether to believe me, and then, without warning, she started crying, the specific, exhausted crying of someone who has been holding something in far longer than they should have had to. "I used to get so angry at Mom," she said, "for keeping that photo on the mantle. I thought it was performative, like she wanted people to see how sad she was about it. I didn't understand, until right now, sitting next to an actual person instead of a photograph, how strange it is to grieve someone you never even got the chance to be angry at directly." I want to pause here and tell you something. I didn't fully understand myself until I stood in front of my own gravestone 2 days later, in the Sterling family plot, on a quiet hillside outside the city. My name was there, carved in granite, with a death date that corresponded to absolutely nothing real. Beneath my name, an inscription Margaret had chosen. Taken too soon, remembered always. Remembered, apparently, just not closely enough for anyone to notice, for 15 years, that the version of events they'd memorized had been carefully built for them by exactly two people, my father and my stepmother. I stood in front of that gravestone for almost an hour, and the strangest part of the entire experience wasn't grief. It was a kind of vertigo, the specific dizziness of realizing that an entire fabricated version of your death had become more real, more documented, more believed, than the actual 15 years you had genuinely lived. I didn't yet understand why my father had done it this thoroughly, this permanently. I assumed, standing on that hillside, that I eventually would have to make peace with simply never knowing. That assumption lasted exactly 2 more days, until a man named Mr. Holbrook called my hotel room and introduced himself as my father's estate attorney. "Miss Cole," he said, using the name I'd lived under for 15 years, which told me immediately that whatever was coming, my father had clearly known exactly where to find me this entire time, even while letting everyone else believe I was gone. "Your father left specific instructions, 12 years ago, regarding a sealed item to be released only under one very particular condition, that you yourself returned in person and your identity could be verified." "What kind of item?" "A recording," he said. "I'm not permitted to say more over the phone. I can tell you that he updated it as recently as 4 months ago, shortly before he passed. I can also tell you, Ms. Cole, that your father asked me a question every single year for the past 12 years, the same question, almost like a ritual. He asked if there had been any sign of you, any sign at all." "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Holbrook said quietly, "that there hadn't been. Not once in 12 years, until 11 days ago." Mr. Holbrook's office sat on the 14th floor of a building downtown, the kind of quiet, expensive space designed to make difficult conversations feel slightly more bearable. I arrived the next morning carrying a folder of documents proving my identity, fingerprints from an old security clearance, a DNA sample I'd provided the day before to a lab Holbrook trusted, dental records pulled from my childhood orthodontist, who, remarkably, still practiced 2 towns away from where I grew up. "I want to be transparent with you," Holbrook said, once the verification had been formally confirmed. "Your father built several layers of protection around this. Partly legal, partly, I suspect, emotional. He didn't want this recording released to anyone who couldn't prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that they were actually you. He was afraid, I think, of someone using a story like this to extort the estate. He thought someone might pretend to be his dead daughter. He thought a great many things, Miss Cole, most of which I wasn't privy to until very recently myself." Holbrook slid a thick folder across the desk before continuing. "He left this for you as well. Personal files he kept in a separate safe, not part of the company's records. I haven't reviewed the contents myself. He was specific that it was for your eyes only, alongside the recording." The folder was heavier than I expected. Inside, organized with the same careful precision I remembered from his old office files, were documents I hadn't known existed, internal Sterling Dynamics memos from 15 years earlier, several bearing handwritten notes in margins I recognized instantly as my father's tight, deliberate script. Wire transfer records. A private investigator's report, dated just 6 weeks after my death, documenting threats made against my father personally by someone whose name had been redacted in black marker, apparently by my father himself, even in his own private files. And, near the bottom, a single page that stopped me completely. Before I reached it, though, I found something smaller that affected me almost as much. A folder of photographs I didn't know existed, printed quietly over the years from what must have been long-distance surveillance my father had commissioned, just to confirm I was still safe without ever making contact. Me at my engineering school graduation under my new name, captured from across a crowded auditorium. Me outside my first apartment after moving for a new auditing contract, 3 years into my new life. Me, Considerably more recently, walking out of a client's office building looking in the photograph, exactly as tired and unaware as I remembered actually feeling that day. On the back of each photograph, in my father's handwriting, a single date and a single word: alive. He had checked, quietly, carefully, every single year, without ever once reaching out, without ever once risking the fragile safety he believed my disappearance had purchased for me. I sat with that folder for a long time before I could bring myself to continue to the transcript beneath it. It was a transcript, evidently recorded and later typed up, of a phone call. No names were listed at the top, only initials: FD and RS. You understand what happens if this gets out before the IPO closes. The transcript read, attributed to FD $300 million of investor confidence, gone overnight, over part that fails in maybe 1 out of every 8,000 units. You let your daughter walk into a federal regulator's office with this, Richard, and I promise you, there will be consequences that extend considerably further than a stock price. My father's response, according to the transcript: are you threatening my daughter? FD's reply: I'm telling you what happens to people who get in the way of things this large. I'd think very carefully about which version of this story you want to still have a daughter at the end of. I sat in that office, reading that exchange 3 times, before I finally understood, with a clarity that made my hands go cold, exactly what my father had actually done 15 years earlier. He hadn't disappeared me to protect the company's reputation. He had disappeared me to save my life, from a threat he had taken seriously enough to dismantle his own family rather than risk being wrong about it. Who is FD? I asked Holbrook. He hesitated, longer than felt comfortable. I believe, he finally said, that you should hear the recording before I answer that. The recording itself was on a small drive, and Holbrook left me alone in his office to listen to it, on a laptop he set up specifically for the purpose, with headphones, because, he said quietly, your father was very specific that this should be heard, not just played in a room. My father's voice, recorded 4 months before his death, sounded weaker than I remembered, but unmistakably his. Vivian, if you're hearing this, it means you came back, and that alone tells me something I've hoped to be true for 15 years. I don't know how to apologize for what I did to you, so I'm not going to try to make it sound smaller than it was. I destroyed your life to save it. I have had 15 years to decide whether that was the right choice, and I still don't fully know. I only know it was the choice that let you keep breathing. Frank Delgado was your stepmother's brother, and at the time, the chief operating officer of this company. He had personally signed off on the decision to falsify the stress test data you found, because the IPO he'd staked his entire career on couldn't survive a recall that size, 3 weeks before the offering closed. When you brought it to me, I went to him directly, hoping to handle it quietly, the way I'd handled difficult things my whole career. He made it extremely clear, in a conversation I recorded without his knowledge, that quiet wasn't an option he was offering me anymore. He told me what would happen to you if you went to regulators. I believed him completely. I still believe, to this day, that I was right to believe him. I couldn't go to the police with what I had. It was one recorded phone call, ambiguous enough that any decent lawyer could explain it away as a business disagreement, and I was terrified that pursuing it openly would simply accelerate exactly the danger I was trying to protect you from. So, I did the only thing I could think of that would make the threat stop completely. I made you disappear so thoroughly that hurting you would no longer serve any purpose. I am not asking you to tell me that was the right decision. I am only telling you it was the only one I could live with. I spent 12 years building a case, slowly, carefully, the same way you found that original discrepancy, one piece of documentation at a time. I have evidence now that I didn't have then. Enough, I believe, to finally hold Frank accountable for what he did and what he threatened to do. I was planning to release all of it publicly before my diagnosis made that timeline considerably shorter than I'd hoped. I am leaving instructions, alongside this recording, for everything to be made public at the next full shareholder meeting, regardless of whether you ever come back to claim it. I wanted you to hear it first, though, if you ever did. Not because you need my permission to know the truth. Because I needed you to hear, in my own voice, exactly why I let the entire world believe my daughter was dead. I never once believed it myself, Vivian. I just needed everyone else to. I sat in that office for a long time after the recording ended, headphones still on, listening to nothing at all. I didn't go to Caleb or Margaret immediately with what I'd learned. Holbrook advised against it, gently but firmly, the same way Mr. Alvarez once advised a friend of mine in a different situation entirely. Let the truth arrive all at once, in front of people who can't simply argue it away in private. There's a shareholder meeting scheduled in 11 days, Holbrook told me. Your father specified it directly in his instructions. The full board, major investors, senior staff. It was already on the calendar before he passed, originally meant to address succession planning. I believe he intended it to become something considerably larger. In the days that followed, Margaret made it clear, in increasingly less subtle ways, that she had no intention of allowing whatever I was planning to proceed quietly. She called my hotel twice, the first time icy and controlled, demanding to know what exactly I thought I was doing showing up after 15 years, the second time considerably less controlled, accusing me directly of attempting to extort the estate using a story she insisted, despite the DNA results already confirmed, could not possibly hold up under real scrutiny. You think a DNA test proves anything, she said, her voice tight. Anyone can manipulate a lab result if they have enough money and enough motivation. I'm not asking you to take my word for it, I told her. The science already has. Frank is a respected member of this community, she said, and I noted, carefully, that I hadn't mentioned Frank's name to her at all. Whatever your father told you in whatever recording Holbrook played for you, you need to understand that grief makes people say things, write things, that aren't always accurate. I asked her, directly, whether she had known what Frank threatened 15 years ago. The silence on the other end of that call lasted long enough that I had my answer before she spoke again. I knew there were business disagreements, she finally said. I didn't know the specifics. Richard handled that side of things. I didn't believe her.
I want to be honest about that.
Something in the speed of her denial, the careful specificity of I didn't know the specifics, rather than a flat I didn't know, told me she had understood considerably more than she was admitting, possibly at the time, certainly by now. 3 days before the meeting, Holbrook helped me track down Nathaniel Boyd, who was living quietly 2 states away, working part-time at a small auto parts supplier far smaller than the company he'd given 19 years of his career to. He answered the door himself, and the moment he saw me, standing on his porch 15 years after the worst week of both our lives, he simply said, I always wondered if they'd actually gotten you too. We sat at his kitchen table for almost 2 hours. He told me what he remembered from those final days before he was let go, a meeting with Frank Delgado he described as the only time in 19 years I was genuinely afraid of a person I worked with, and a severance package considerably larger than his role would have normally warranted, attached to paperwork that included, buried in dense legal language, a strict confidentiality clause covering any internal quality control matters discussed during your tenure. I told myself for 15 years that I should have fought it, he said. Hired a lawyer, gone to the regulators myself, something. I had a wife with a chronic illness and a mortgage I couldn't have survived losing that severance over. I made the choice that let my family keep our house. I've never stopped feeling like a coward about it anyway. You weren't a coward, I told him. You were exactly as afraid as my own father was, for exactly the same reasons. When I asked if he'd be willing to attend the shareholder meeting in person, he didn't hesitate the way I expected him to. 19 years, he said quietly. I'd like my name back if there's still a way to get it. Caleb, to his credit, reacted very differently once I sat down with him privately and explained, as gently as I could manage, what I'd actually learned. He went pale, the same way Nathaniel Boyd had gone pale 15 years earlier, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. Uncle Frank still sits on the board, he finally said. He's been pushing for an acquisition deal for the last 2 years, something I never fully understood the urgency behind. If what you're saying is true, he trailed off, running both hands through his hair. I need to see the actual documents. Not because I don't believe you, because I need to understand exactly how deep this goes before that shareholder meeting happens. I showed him everything. The transcript, the wire transfers, the investigator's report. I watched my half-brother, A man I had genuinely worried might side reflexively with the family narrative he'd grown up inside, instead spend 3 straight hours going through every page with the same careful seriousness our father had once brought to his own quality control reports. "He's going to try to stop the meeting," Caleb finally said. "Or discredit you before it happens. You should expect that." He was right. 4 days before the meeting, an anonymous tip reached 2 financial news outlets, suggesting that a woman claiming to be the long-deceased daughter of Sterling Dynamics founder was attempting an elaborate inheritance fraud scheme. My photo, an old one from before I disappeared, appeared briefly online beside a headline questioning my legitimacy, before Holbrook's office issued a brief, carefully worded statement confirming that identity verification had already been independently completed. Frank Delgado himself called me directly, 2 days before the meeting, his voice smooth in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up even over the phone. "I understand you've been going through some old company files," he said. "I'd hate for grief and confusion after such a long absence to lead you toward conclusions that could be genuinely damaging to you personally if they turned out to be inaccurate." "Is that a threat, Frank?" There was a brief pause before he laughed, a short, controlled sound with no warmth in it at all. "It's advice. From someone who's known this family considerably longer than you've apparently been part of it lately." I hung up without responding, and I will admit, my hands were shaking slightly when I did, not from fear exactly, but from the strange, vertiginous experience of hearing 15 years later almost the exact same tone my father had described from that original recorded phone call. The meeting was held in Sterling Dynamics' largest auditorium, the same room, I later learned, where my father had once announced the company's IPO success. 12 years after the disappearance, he'd engineered to keep me alive long enough to one day stand in that same room myself. By the time Caleb and I arrived, the room was already full. Board members, major investors, senior staff who had worked for the company for decades. A handful of journalists Holbrook had quietly notified, understanding, correctly, that my father's instructions required this to happen publicly, not behind closed doors where it could later be minimized or denied. Margaret sat near the front, her posture rigid. Frank Delgado sat 2 seats down from her, his expression carefully neutral in the specific way of someone who has spent decades learning to control a room through composure alone. The meeting opened with standard business, succession planning items Caleb moved through quickly, his voice steadier than I expected given what I knew he was about to do. Then he set down his notes, looked out at the room, and said, "There's something else on the agenda today. Something my father specifically arranged before his passing." Holbrook stood and explained, briefly, the conditions of the recording, the verification process, the documents that had accompanied it. Then he played the recording itself, through the auditorium sound system, my father's weakened voice filling a room full of people who had spent 15 years believing a story that voice was now systematically dismantling, sentence by sentence. I watched faces change throughout that room as the recording played. Confusion first, among people hearing about a falsified stress test for the first time. Then a slow, spreading horror, as my father's voice named Frank Delgado directly, described the threat, explained the funeral, explained 15 years of a fabricated death he had personally maintained rather than risk his daughter's life. Frank stood up halfway through, his composure finally cracking. "This is a recording made by a dying man," he said, his voice too loud for the room. "Grief, medication, illness, any of those things could explain." "There's a transcript," Holbrook said calmly, holding up the document. "Independently authenticated by a forensic audio specialist last week, confirming the recorded phone call's timeline matches phone records from 15 years ago. We're also prepared to share wire transfer documentation showing payments from an account under Mr. Delgado's control to the private contractor who falsified the original stress test data." Frank's face went the same color I imagined mine must have gone, standing in front of my own gravestone 2 weeks earlier. An older woman near the middle of the auditorium stood up next, unprompted, identifying herself as a longtime supplier relations manager who had worked under Frank for almost a decade. "I want it noted," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "that 3 of U.S. raised concerns about that exact stress test batch 15 years ago, in writing, and were told the matter had been reviewed and resolved at the executive level. I assumed at the time that meant by Mr. Sterling himself. I never imagined it meant the opposite. She sat back down to a silence that felt, for the first time that afternoon, less like shock and more like recognition spreading slowly through a room full of people quietly reassembling 15 years of unanswered questions. I stood up then for the first time in that meeting, and the entire room turned to look at me the way the cathedral had turned to look at me 2 weeks earlier.
Different silence this time.
Less disbelief. More reckoning. "My name is Vivian Sterling," I said, using a name I hadn't spoken publicly in 15 years. "Some of you knew me before I disappeared. Most of you only know the version of my death you were told. I'm not here for revenge against this company. My father built something genuinely good, and I watched 15 years ago exactly how far some people were willing to go to protect a number on a balance sheet instead of the truth. I'm here because the families who drove cars with that defective component deserve to know what actually happened. I'm here because Nathaniel Boyd, the man fired for agreeing with me, deserves to have his name cleared publicly, not just privately. And I'm here because my father spent the last 12 years of his life quietly trying to fix something he believed, right or wrong, he had no safer way to fix at the time. Nathaniel Boyd, I should mention, was sitting in the third row. Holbrook had quietly located him 2 days earlier and invited him personally. He stood, slowly, when I said his name, and the small, grateful nod he gave me told me everything I needed to know about how much those 15 years of silence had cost him too. The board voted, before the meeting ended, to suspend Frank Delgado pending a full independent investigation, with several members stating plainly that the documentation alone, regardless of any further findings, represented more than sufficient grounds. Margaret left the auditorium before the vote concluded, and I noticed, watching her go, that nobody moved to stop her or come for her. The months that followed were not simple, and I think it would dishonor my father's actual intentions to pretend otherwise. Frank Delgado was formally indicted 4 months later on charges related to fraud and witness intimidation, based largely on the documentation my father had spent over a decade quietly assembling. Sterling Dynamics issued a public, voluntary recall on the affected component line, 15 years after it should have happened, along with a compensation fund for any documented incidents connected to the original defect. Margaret and I have not reconciled. Not really. I don't know if we ever will. She maintains to this day that she didn't know the specifics, and I have made peace with the fact that I may never know exactly how much of that is true. Caleb and I, on the other hand, have spent the past year slowly rebuilding something neither of us expected to need. He asked me, 3 months after the shareholder meeting, to formally rejoin the company's board, in an advisory capacity overseeing product safety standards, a role I accepted on one condition, that Nathaniel Boyd be brought back in a senior capacity, with 19 years of unjust termination finally, publicly corrected. Lily and I see each other almost every week now. She still sometimes asks me questions with the careful hesitance of someone double-checking that a dream hasn't ended, and I have stopped finding that strange because some days it still feels that way to me too. I visited my own gravestone one more time, 6 months after the funeral, this time with Lily beside me. The Sterling family eventually had it removed, replaced instead with a small plaque near the company's new safety research wing, the one named, at Caleb's insistence, after Nathaniel Boyd rather than after me, which felt, somehow, exactly right. Margaret moved out of the main house quietly that same spring, into a smaller property she'd owned separately for years, and Caleb told me once, without elaborating much further, that she'd started seeing a therapist for the first time in her life. I don't know what that will eventually amount to, if anything. I've stopped needing to know, the same way I've stopped needing her to admit out loud exactly how much she understood 15 years ago. Some answers, I've learned, matter less once you've already built a life that doesn't depend on receiving them. I think often about the recording, about my father's voice telling me he destroyed my life to save it, and about whether I've actually forgiven him for the way he chose to do it. I'm not sure forgiveness is even the right word for what I feel. It's closer to understanding, the specific, complicated understanding that comes from learning that someone's worst decision and their deepest love were, in his case, the exact same choice, made by a frightened man who genuinely believed he had no safer option. If there's one thing I carry from everything that happened that year, it's this. The people who love us most don't always protect us the way we'd choose to be protected, and sometimes the truth behind their worst decisions doesn't arrive until long after the damage is done. If there's someone in your life whose choices never made sense to you, someone you wrote off years ago without ever hearing their full reasoning, it might be worth asking, while you still can, whether there's a recording of your own still waiting to be played. Thank you for spending this time with me, and thank you for helping keep stories like this one alive.